Tonight, we're entering the mind of history's most misunderstood strategist, a man who wrote not about cruelty, but about the art of never needing to use it. You might think Niccolò Machiavelli was some sort of ruthless schemer, obsessed with manipulation and power games. But what if I told you he was actually writing a survival manual for anyone who's ever felt the sting of disrespect and wondered how to respond with dignity intact? If you're enjoying these philosophical journeys into the quieter wisdom of great thinkers, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me that these gentle explorations into the deeper currents of human understanding are resonating with you. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community connect through these stories, each of us settling into the night from our own corner of the world. Now dim the lights wherever you are, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or perhaps light a candle if that helps you unwind. Let your body ease into whatever position feels most comfortable. There's no wrong way to receive these ideas. Take a gentle breath, feeling your shoulders drop just a little, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of what it truly means to command respect without losing your soul in the process. Imagine, if you will, that you've just stepped into a small study on the outskirts of Florence, Italy. The year is 1513, and the late afternoon light filters through a single window, casting long shadows across worn wooden floors. The air carries the scent of ink and parchment, mixed with something earthier, perhaps the smell of olive trees drifting in from the countryside beyond. As you settle into a simple wooden chair, feeling its smooth surface worn by years of use, you hear the distant scratch of a quill moving across paper, punctuated by the occasional pause, as if the writer is searching for precisely the right word. This is where we find Niccolò Machiavelli, not in some grand palace plotting the downfall of enemies, but in exile in simplicity, writing by candlelight about something far more profound than political maneuvering. The man before you, perhaps 50 years old, his face marked by experience but his eyes still sharp with intelligence, has just lost everything. His position, his influence, his security, all swept away by the changing political tides of Renaissance Italy. You might recognize this feeling yourself. That moment when circumstances beyond your control shift the ground beneath your feet, when you realize that the rules you thought governed your world were far more fragile than you'd imagined. But here's what makes this scene so remarkable, and why we're visiting this particular study on this particular evening. Machiavelli isn't writing about revenge or bitterness. He's not crafting elaborate schemes to regain his lost position. Instead, he's doing something far more valuable. He's thinking deeply about the nature of power itself, about what it means to maintain your dignity and effectiveness in a world that doesn't always respect boundaries, that doesn't always play fair. As you watch him write, you notice something in his demeanor that might surprise you. There's a calmness there, a kind of settled understanding. This isn't a man consumed by anger or resentment, though he certainly has reason for both. This is someone who has learned to see past the immediate emotional response to something deeper and more strategic. He pauses in his writing, perhaps sensing your presence, and for a moment you catch a glimpse of what he's working on, not a manual for tyrants, but a guide for anyone who must navigate the complex social territories of human interaction. Like many of us, Machiavelli had discovered that the world doesn't always reward kindness with kindness, that sometimes good intentions are met with exploitation, that occasionally someone will test your boundaries not out of malice, but simply to see what they can get away with. He'd learned, perhaps the hard way, that there's a difference between being nice and being respected, between avoiding conflict and commanding genuine regard. Most importantly, he'd come to understand that the ability to respond strategically rather than emotionally isn't about becoming cold or calculating. It's about developing what he called virtue, a kind of practical wisdom that allows you to meet challenges with both strength and grace. You might have experienced this yourself, that moment when someone says something that feels like a test, not quite an insult, but not quite respect either. Maybe it's a colleague who makes passive-aggressive comments in meetings, or a family member who consistently crosses small boundaries, or a friend who takes your generosity for granted. In those moments, you probably felt that familiar internal struggle between wanting to respond forcefully and wanting to keep the peace, between standing up for yourself and maintaining relationships. Machiavelli understood this struggle intimately, and what he discovered was that there's often a third path, one that preserves both your dignity and your relationships, but requires a different kind of strength than most of us have been taught. The candle flickers as evening deepens, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls of the study. There's something soothing about this scene, about watching someone think deeply about problems that are as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. The scratch of the quill continues, steady and purposeful, and you realize that what you're witnessing isn't the birth of manipulation or cunning, but the development of a more sophisticated understanding of human nature, one that recognizes that respect isn't something you can demand or expect, but something you must earn through the consistent demonstration of certain qualities. This isn't about becoming someone you're not, or adopting a persona that feels foreign to your nature. It's about understanding that every social interaction contains invisible currents of power and respect, and that learning to navigate these currents skillfully is one of the most valuable forms of intelligence you can develop. Machiavelli called these unpredictable social challenges fortuna, like sudden storms that can catch you off guard and threaten to overwhelm you. But he also understood that there's an opposing force, which he called virtue, the ability to prepare for these storms, to respond to them strategically, and even to turn them to your advantage. As the light continues to fade and the room grows quieter, you find yourself drawn into this ancient conversation about timeless problems. There's something deeply reassuring about discovering that the challenges you face in maintaining your dignity and commanding respect aren't new or unique to our time. People have always had to deal with disrespect, with boundary testing, with the delicate balance between being strong and being kind. And some people, like the man writing quietly in the candlelight before you, have thought deeply enough about these challenges to offer us insights that remain remarkably relevant. The evening air carries the distant sound of church bells marking the hour, and Machiavelli sets down his quill for a moment, stretching fingers that have been gripping it for hours. In that brief pause, you sense something profound, a kind of peace that comes not from avoiding life's difficulties, but from developing the wisdom to meet them well. This is what we're here to explore together, not how to become manipulative or calculating, but how to develop the kind of inner strength and strategic clarity that allows you to maintain your boundaries without losing your compassion, to command respect without sacrificing your authenticity. As we prepare to journey deeper into these insights, you might notice how the study around you has grown more comfortable, how the shadows have become friends rather than threats, how even the challenging ideas we're about to explore feel safe within this context of gentle learning. This is the gift of approaching difficult topics from a place of rest rather than urgency, of philosophy rather than immediate problem-solving. We can examine these concepts with curiosity rather than desperation, allowing them to settle into our understanding like sediment in still water. To truly understand Machiavelli's insight about commanding respect, we need to first step back into his world, a place where survival often depended on reading the hidden currents of power, where a single misjudgment could mean exile or worse, where the ability to navigate complex social relationships wasn't just a skill but a necessity for life itself. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, you might notice how the gentle wisdom we're exploring tonight emerged from circumstances far more turbulent than our own, yet speaks to experiences that are surprisingly familiar. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of Florence in the early morning hours of 1513, when the city is just beginning to stir. The cobblestones beneath your feet are still damp with dew, and the air carries the mingled scents of fresh bread from nearby bakeries and the earthier smell of horses and leather from the stables. As you move through these winding passages, you can hear the distant tolling of church bells calling the faithful to morning prayers, punctuated by the gentle splash of water from the fountains that dot the city squares. This is a world suspended between the medieval past and the Renaissance future, where ancient traditions still hold sway, but new ideas are beginning to reshape how people think about power, authority, and human nature itself. The Florence that surrounds you is a city in transition, much like the modern workplaces and social environments where we find ourselves navigating complex relationships today. Here, wealthy merchant families like the Medici compete for influence not through force of arms alone, but through subtle alliances, strategic marriages, and the careful cultivation of reputation. You might recognize something familiar in this: the way influence flows through networks of relationships, the importance of being seen as reliable, the delicate balance between appearing strong enough to be respected and flexible enough to be trusted. As you continue your walk, imagine turning down a smaller lane that leads away from the city center, past gardens where olive trees cast dappled shadows in the morning light. The sounds of the city gradually fade, replaced by the gentler symphony of birds greeting the day and the whisper of wind through leaves. It's here, about 7 miles outside Florence, that you'll find a modest farmhouse surrounded by vineyards and fields, the temporary home of a man whose career in politics has come to an abrupt and humiliating end. Niccolò Machiavelli awakens each morning in this simple dwelling, far removed from the corridors of power where he once walked with confidence and purpose. The contrast couldn't be more stark. From the halls of the Palazzo Vecchio, where his counsel was sought on matters of state, to this rustic exile where his most pressing concerns involved the price of grain and the condition of his small flock of sheep. Yet there's something profound happening in this apparent defeat, something that speaks to anyone who has ever found themselves stripped of their familiar context and forced to discover who they really are beneath their titles and roles. You might have experienced this yourself, perhaps when a job ended unexpectedly, or when a relationship that defined much of your identity came to a close, or when some other major change forced you to examine the assumptions that had guided your life. There's a particular kind of clarity that can emerge from such moments, a freedom that comes paradoxically from having fewer options, a chance to think more deeply about what truly matters when the external markers of success or status have been stripped away. Watch as Machiavelli begins his daily routine in this place of exile. In the early morning hours, while the air is still cool and the light soft, he attends to practical matters, corresponding with friends who remain in positions of influence, managing the modest affairs of his small property, engaging in the kind of mundane tasks that ground even the most sophisticated minds in the immediate realities of daily life. There's something almost meditative about this routine, this return to basics that allows him to see clearly without the distractions of political urgency or social performance. But it's in the evening that the true work begins, the work that will ultimately prove more influential than any political maneuvering he accomplished during his years in office. As the day's heat begins to fade and the countryside settles into the gentle rhythm of dusk, Machiavelli undergoes what he himself describes as a kind of transformation. He sets aside the rough clothes of a country gentleman and dons the formal robes of a scholar, preparing himself for communion with the great minds of antiquity. This ritual of changing clothes might seem quaint, but it represents something profound about the shift from the practical to the contemplative, from dealing with immediate problems to grappling with timeless questions. Imagine stepping into his study during these evening hours, feeling the transition from the warm air outside to the cooler atmosphere within these stone walls. The room is simple but dignified, a desk positioned near the window to catch the last of the natural light, shelves lined with books that represent centuries of human wisdom, a few chairs arranged as if for conversation with invisible guests. The scent of candle wax mingles with the mustier smell of old leather and parchment, creating an atmosphere that speaks to the serious business of thinking deeply about human nature and the challenges of living well in an imperfect world. Here, night after night, Machiavelli enters into what he calls a conversation with the ancients, reading the works of Caesar and Tacitus, Plutarch and Livy, absorbing their insights about leadership, conflict, and the eternal human struggles for security and respect. But he's not simply studying history for its own sake. He's mining these ancient experiences for practical wisdom that might help anyone navigate the treacherous waters of human relationships, whether in the grand theater of international politics or in the more intimate challenges of daily social interaction. You might recognize this process from your own quieter moments of reflection, when you found yourself thinking back through difficult interactions, trying to understand what went well and what didn't, searching for patterns that might guide you better in future encounters. This is the same impulse that drives Machiavelli's evening studies, a desire to understand the deeper currents that govern human behavior, to find principles that remain constant even as circumstances change. What emerges from these solitary hours of reflection is something remarkable, not a cynical manual for manipulation, as his work is often mischaracterized, but a clear-eyed assessment of how power actually works in human relationships. He's writing about survival in its broadest sense, not just physical survival, but the preservation of dignity, autonomy, and effectiveness in a world that doesn't always reward good intentions with good outcomes. This is wisdom born from experience, tested by failure, and refined through careful observation of what works and what doesn't in the complex dance of human interaction. The political landscape that surrounds Machiavelli's exile helps explain why these insights feel so relevant today. Renaissance Italy is a patchwork of competing city-states, each with its own interests, alliances, and ambitions. There's no overarching authority to enforce rules of fair play, no neutral arbiter to appeal to when conflicts arise. Success depends entirely on one's ability to read situations accurately, to respond strategically rather than merely emotionally, and to build a reputation that deters aggression while encouraging cooperation. Sound familiar? This is essentially the same environment we navigate in our modern workplaces, social groups, and even family dynamics, spaces where formal rules exist but informal power dynamics often matter more. In this world of shifting alliances and hidden agendas, Machiavelli observes that those who survive and thrive share certain characteristics. They understand that intentions matter less than results, that being consistently predictable in your responses to disrespect is more valuable than being uniformly nice, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to set a clear boundary that prevents them from crossing lines they'll later regret. These insights don't emerge from a desire to dominate others, but from a deep understanding of what it takes to maintain mutual respect in relationships where power is always in flux. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli recognizes that the challenges he's analyzing aren't unique to his time or circumstance. The fundamental questions he's grappling with, how to respond to disrespect, how to maintain dignity under pressure, how to balance strength with compassion, these are perennial human concerns that each generation must navigate anew. The specific tactics may evolve, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent across centuries and cultures. As the candles burn lower in his evening study, casting longer shadows on the walls, Machiavelli continues his patient work of distilling complex human interactions into principles that can guide decision-making under pressure. He's not writing for princes alone, but for anyone who must make strategic choices about how to respond when their boundaries are tested, their dignity challenged, or their good faith exploited. The wisdom emerging from this humble farmhouse study will eventually travel far beyond the political upheavals of Renaissance Italy, speaking to anyone who has ever wondered how to maintain their integrity while effectively navigating the inevitable conflicts of human relationships. This understanding of context, of a man thinking deeply about timeless problems while surrounded by the immediate pressures of political instability, naturally raises the question of what specific insights emerged from this period of reflection. The principles that crystallized during these long evening hours of study and contemplation would prove to have remarkable staying power, offering a framework for understanding not just political maneuvering, but the fundamental dynamics that govern all human interactions where respect and power are at stake. Following this thread deeper into Machiavelli's contemplative world, we discover something profound about the very nature of strength itself. What if strength isn't about never being challenged, but about how you respond when you inevitably are? This question seems to hover in the air of that candlelit study, where a man stripped of his political power is discovering something far more valuable than any title or position could provide. As you settle more deeply into this evening scene, perhaps feeling the weight of your own day beginning to lift from your shoulders, you might notice how this ancient insight speaks to something you've experienced yourself. Those moments when life throws you something unexpected, something that tests not just your patience, but your very sense of who you are. Imagine sitting across from Machiavelli in that simple study, watching as he sets down his quill and gazes thoughtfully at the candle flame dancing between you. The scent of melted wax mingles with the cooler night air drifting through the open window, carrying with it the distant sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus. In this peaceful moment, he begins to explain something that has become clear to him through his studies of both ancient history and recent personal experience. A fundamental truth about how human beings navigate the unpredictable currents of social life. There are two forces, he might say, his voice quiet but certain in the gathering dusk, that shape every human encounter, every relationship, every moment when respect hangs in the balance. The first force, he explains, using the Italian word that carries deeper meaning than its English translation, is fortuna, a concept that encompasses far more than simple luck or chance. Picture fortuna as you might imagine a river in spring flood, swollen with snowmelt and autumn rains, powerful beyond prediction, capable of sweeping away the most carefully constructed plans and leaving entirely new landscapes in its wake. Fortuna, in the context of human relationships, represents all those moments when someone else's choices crash into your carefully ordered world like that flooding river. Perhaps you recognize this force from your own experience. The colleague who suddenly takes credit for your work during an important meeting. The family member who makes a cutting remark just when you're feeling vulnerable. The friend who consistently arrives late, treating your time as less valuable than their own convenience. These aren't natural disasters. They're manifestations of fortuna in its social form, moments when other people's actions or attitudes challenge your sense of dignity, your boundaries, your very identity. The second force, which Machiavelli calls virtù, is humanity's response to fortuna's unpredictable power. But here's where his insight becomes particularly nuanced, where the wisdom of his approach reveals itself in ways that might surprise you. Virtù isn't virtue in the conventional sense. It's not about being nice or accommodating or turning the other cheek when challenged. Instead, it represents something more sophisticated, the capacity to respond strategically rather than merely emotionally, the ability to meet unexpected challenges with a kind of inner flexibility that maintains your essential integrity while adapting to circumstances you didn't choose. Think of virtù as the engineering wisdom that builds levees and channels before the flood season arrives, that studies the patterns of past storms to prepare for future ones, that understands how to work with powerful forces rather than simply hoping they won't appear. When someone disrespects you, virtù is what allows you to pause in that crucial moment between their action and your response, to choose a reaction that serves your long-term interests rather than just your immediate emotional impulse. You might have experienced this kind of strategic thinking in your own quieter moments, perhaps when you've reflected on a difficult conversation and realized that your initial reaction, anger, hurt, the desire to strike back, wouldn't actually serve you well. In those moments of clarity, you're touching something very close to what Machiavelli means by virtù. the wisdom to respond to challenges in ways that strengthen rather than weaken your position, that build rather than erode your reputation for being someone who can't be easily pushed around. The beauty of this framework lies in how it reframes our entire relationship with conflict and disrespect. Instead of seeing these challenges as purely negative experiences to be avoided, Virtue recognizes them as inevitable features of social life that can actually become opportunities for demonstrating and developing strength. It's similar to how a master gardener doesn't curse the winter frost, but instead uses those harsh months to plan for spring, understanding that both seasons serve essential functions in the larger cycle of growth. As you contemplate this ancient wisdom, you might notice how it offers a kind of relief from the impossible standard of perpetual harmony that modern culture sometimes promotes. Machiavelli's insight suggests that conflict isn't a sign of failure in our relationships or communities. It's simply part of the weather of human interaction, as natural and inevitable as storm systems moving across a landscape. What matters isn't whether we encounter these storms, but how skillfully we navigate them when they arrive. This perspective transforms disrespect from a personal attack into something more like a test of competence, similar to how a sailor views challenging weather not as a cosmic injustice, but as an opportunity to demonstrate seamanship. The goal isn't to eliminate the possibility of rough seas, that's beyond anyone's control, but to become the kind of person who can maintain course and dignity regardless of conditions. Perhaps most importantly, this framework reveals something crucial about the nature of respect itself. Respect isn't primarily something we receive because we're good people who deserve it. It's something we earn through the consistent demonstration of virtue, through showing others, encounter by encounter, that we possess the inner resources to meet challenges calmly and effectively. People respect those who can't be easily destabilized not because they fear them, but because they recognize a quality of inner strength that feels both admirable and trustworthy. Interestingly, this ancient insight aligns remarkably well with what modern psychology tells us about emotional regulation and resilience. The person who can pause between stimulus and response, who can access their higher reasoning faculties even when provoked, who can choose their battles wisely rather than reacting impulsively to every slight. This person isn't just practicing good emotional hygiene. They're embodying exactly what Machiavelli meant by virtue. The candlelight flickers again in that peaceful study, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls as these timeless concepts settle into a deeper understanding. You might find yourself thinking of your own life, of moments when you've successfully navigated challenging social dynamics and moments when you haven't, beginning to see patterns that perhaps weren't visible before. There's something both humbling and empowering about recognizing that these challenges are universal, that even the most sophisticated thinkers throughout history have grappled with the same fundamental questions about how to maintain dignity while living among other complex, unpredictable human beings. As this framework of virtue and fortuna becomes clearer, like objects emerging from morning mist, you begin to sense how this philosophical foundation supports more specific insights about the actual mechanics of commanding respect. The interplay between these two forces, between the challenges we can't control and the responses we can, creates a space where practical wisdom becomes possible, where ancient insights transform into modern guidance for navigating the delicate architecture of human relationships. This understanding opens a doorway to something even more fascinating: the recognition that respect itself operates according to invisible but remarkably consistent patterns, like the hidden geometry that determines how cathedral builders knew their soaring arches would hold. Picture yourself standing in the center of a grand medieval cathedral, feeling the cool stone beneath your feet and sensing the vast space rising above you into shadows. The air carries the faint scent of old incense and polished wood, while shafts of colored light from stained glass windows create shifting patterns across the worn floor stones. What you're witnessing is one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in understanding invisible forces, how weight and stress and balance can be managed so skillfully that tons of stone seem to float effortlessly in space, creating an environment that feels both powerful and peaceful. Human social relationships operate according to equally sophisticated but largely invisible principles, structures of power and respect that most of us navigate intuitively without fully understanding the underlying architecture. Just as those medieval builders understood that certain principles of physics remain constant regardless of the specific cathedral being constructed, Machiavelli recognized that certain principles of social dynamics remain remarkably consistent across different relationships, cultures, and historical periods. Perhaps you've noticed this yourself in the subtle ways that respect seems to flow through any group of people, whether it's a family gathering, a workplace meeting, or even a casual conversation among friends. There's an invisible but unmistakable hierarchy that forms naturally, not necessarily based on formal titles or obvious power, but on something more fundamental: the way different people command attention when they speak, the deference that flows towards certain individuals, the sense that some voices carry more weight than others even when discussing everyday matters. This invisible structure is what social scientists call hierarchy, and far from being an arbitrary human invention, it appears to be as natural and inevitable as the gravitational forces that those cathedral builders learned to work with rather than against. In every stable human group, from small families to large organizations, patterns of dominance and deference emerge organically, creating what researchers describe as the social architecture within which all our interactions take place. But here's where Machiavelli's insight becomes particularly valuable. While we can't control whether these hierarchies exist, they're as inevitable as fortune itself. We can develop virtue in how we position ourselves within them. The key lies in understanding that your place in any social hierarchy isn't determined primarily by formal credentials or inherent worth, but by something far more dynamic and controllable: your reputation. Imagine reputation as a kind of social credit score, but instead of tracking your financial reliability, it tracks your reliability in maintaining boundaries, responding effectively to challenges, and demonstrating the kind of inner strength that others find both reassuring and impressive. Unlike status, which might be assigned to you based on your job title or family position, reputation is something you build through the accumulated evidence of how you handle the inevitable tests that social life presents. You might recognize this dynamic from your own experience. Think of someone you know who commands respect not because of their formal position, but because of how they consistently handle difficult situations. Perhaps it's a colleague who can disagree with authority figures in a way that feels principled rather than defiant, or a friend who can set boundaries with family members without creating lasting drama, or an acquaintance who somehow manages to be both kind and formidable, someone others are drawn to but would hesitate to cross. What these individuals have in common isn't a particular personality type or natural charisma, but rather a consistent pattern of responses to social challenges. When someone tests their boundaries, they respond with clarity rather than confusion. When someone tries to diminish them, they neither escalate aggressively nor retreat submissively, but find a third way that maintains their dignity while de-escalating the conflict. When someone treats them with disrespect, they address it directly but without emotional drama, making it clear that such behavior carries predictable consequences. This consistency is what builds what we might call reputational capital, the accumulated trust that you can be counted on to handle social difficulties with wisdom and strength. It's similar to how a bank builds confidence not through grand gestures, but through the reliable performance of everyday transactions, proving over time that it can be trusted with what matters most to people. Interestingly, this reputational approach to respect reveals something counterintuitive about social power. The individuals who command the most authentic respect are often not those who seek power most aggressively, but those who demonstrate most consistently that they can handle power responsibly. They're the people others turn to when situations become difficult, not because they're the loudest or most demanding, but because they've proven they can navigate complexity without making things worse. As you contemplate this invisible architecture of respect, you might notice how it transforms your understanding of those moments when someone treats you with disrespect. Instead of seeing these incidents as random attacks on your personal worth, you can begin to recognize them as opportunities to demonstrate and develop the kind of strategic response capacity that builds lasting respect. Each challenge becomes less like a personal assault and more like a test of competence, similar to how a skilled sailor views difficult weather not as a cosmic unfairness, but as a chance to demonstrate seamanship. This shift in perspective can be remarkably liberating. Instead of taking disrespect personally, as if it reflects some fundamental inadequacy in yourself, you can approach it more strategically, asking yourself what kind of response would best serve your long-term reputation for being someone who handles challenges gracefully and effectively. The goal isn't to win every battle, but to demonstrate consistently that engaging with you disrespectfully carries costs that most people would prefer to avoid. Perhaps most profoundly, this understanding reveals that respect isn't primarily something you receive because you're a good person who deserves it, but something you earn through the skillful demonstration of certain qualities that others find valuable and reassuring. It's less about moral worth and more about social competence, the ability to navigate the complex currents of human interaction in ways that build rather than erode trust, that create stability rather than chaos, that demonstrates strength without sacrificing compassion. The evening light in that imagined cathedral has shifted now, creating longer shadows between the massive columns, and the sense of ancient wisdom embedded in stone becomes almost tangible. There's something deeply comforting about recognizing that the challenges you face in commanding respect aren't unique to your particular circumstances or historical moment, but are part of the eternal human project of learning to live skillfully among other complex, unpredictable human beings. This realization naturally raises questions about the specific mechanisms through which respect is built and maintained. If reputation is indeed the currency that determines your position in the invisible hierarchy of any social group, then understanding how that reputation is formed and influenced becomes essential knowledge. The principles are surprisingly consistent, but their application requires a kind of practical wisdom that transforms abstract understanding into specific, skillful responses to the inevitable moments when your boundaries are tested and your dignity is challenged. Drifting further along this philosophical path, we encounter what might be Machiavelli's most profound and counterintuitive insight about human relationships, one that challenges much of what modern culture teaches us about the nature of social harmony. Picture yourself returning to that quiet study outside Florence, where the candles have burned lower and the shadows have grown longer against the stone walls. The night air carries the gentle sounds of crickets and the distant rustle of olive leaves in the evening breeze, creating an atmosphere of peaceful contemplation. As you settle into the familiar wooden chair, feeling its worn surface smooth beneath your hands, you notice that Machiavelli has set aside his correspondence with ancient philosophers and is now writing something more immediate, more practical. Observations about the delicate balance between being loved and being respected in human relationships. What if being universally liked isn't actually the path to lasting respect? This question hangs in the candlelit air like incense, challenging assumptions that most of us have carried since childhood. We're taught early that being nice, accommodating, and agreeable will make us popular and secure in our relationships. Yet Machiavelli's careful observation of both historical figures and everyday human interactions reveals something more complex, that there's often an inverse relationship between being constantly pleasant and being genuinely respected. Consider for a moment the people in your own life who command the most authentic respect. Perhaps you'll notice that while they may be well-liked, their respect doesn't depend primarily on their likability. Instead, it stems from something more substantial: the consistent demonstration that they can be counted on to maintain their principles even when doing so creates temporary discomfort for others. These individuals possess what we might call a certain gravitational quality. Others are drawn to their stability and strength, but they also understand intuitively that crossing them would carry genuine consequences. This phenomenon reveals something fundamental about human psychology that Machiavelli articulated with characteristic clarity. Affection based purely on pleasantness is inherently unstable because it depends entirely on your ability to keep others comfortable, while respect based on consistent boundaries is durable because it's grounded in predictable principles rather than fluctuating moods or circumstances. Put differently, love seeks comfort, but respect recognizes strength, and strength sometimes requires saying no to immediate comfort in service of longer-term well-being. Imagine watching a master gardener at work in the early morning light, dew still clinging to the leaves as the sun creates patterns of light and shadow across the cultivated beds. The gardener's relationship with the plants isn't based on giving them everything they might want in any given moment: unlimited water, constant sunshine, freedom from any stress or challenge. Instead, it's based on understanding what they need for long-term health and growth, which sometimes means pruning back branches that are growing too vigorously, or withholding water during certain seasons to encourage deeper root development. This gardener is both caring and firm, nurturing and strategic. The plants don't get to vote on whether they prefer pruning to unlimited growth, but the gardener's willingness to make sometimes difficult decisions is precisely what keeps the garden healthy and beautiful over time. This is analogous to what Machiavelli meant when he suggested that being respected often requires a willingness to disappoint others temporarily in service of what's genuinely beneficial for everyone in the long run. You might recognize this dynamic in your own relationships. Perhaps you've noticed that the family members or friends who consistently avoid conflict, who always say yes even when they mean no, who prioritize immediate harmony over honest communication, often end up being taken for granted rather than treasured. Their very willingness to absorb discomfort for others' sake, while admirable in intention, can inadvertently signal that their own needs and boundaries aren't particularly important, not just to them, but to anyone else either. Conversely, you've probably observed how people respond to individuals who are kind but clearly have limits, who are generous but not endlessly so, who care deeply about relationships but refuse to maintain them at the expense of their own dignity. These people inspire a different quality of affection, one mixed with respect, one that recognizes their kindness as a choice rather than a given, one that values their attention precisely because it's not freely available to anyone who demands it. This doesn't mean cultivating coldness or becoming calculating in your relationships. Rather, it means understanding that authentic kindness sometimes requires the strength to set boundaries. That genuine care sometimes involves disappointing others in small ways to prevent much larger disappointments later. That real love often means saying difficult truths rather than maintaining comfortable lies. The evening air has grown cooler now, and you might notice how the temperature change brings a certain clarity to the atmosphere, making the candlelight seem warmer by contrast. There's something profoundly peaceful about this recognition that respect and affection aren't opposing forces but complementary aspects of healthy relationships. When someone respects your boundaries, their affection carries more weight because you know it's freely given rather than extracted through manipulation or guilt. Interestingly, this principle reveals why many people find themselves trapped in cycles of increasing accommodation and decreasing respect. When someone tests your boundaries, and you respond by lowering them rather than maintaining them, you've inadvertently taught that person that your limits aren't really limits at all, but rather opening positions in an ongoing negotiation. This can create a downward spiral where more and more is expected, while less and less is genuinely appreciated. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself, times when your willingness to be endlessly understanding was met not with gratitude but with escalating demands, when your flexibility was interpreted as weakness rather than strength, when your desire to avoid conflict inadvertently created much larger conflicts down the road. These experiences aren't failures of character, but rather natural consequences of misunderstanding the relationship between boundaries and respect. The alternative approach, what we might call respectful firmness, involves a kind of gentle consistency that can feel unfamiliar if you're accustomed to prioritizing immediate harmony above all else. It means learning to say no with kindness, but without extensive justification, to set boundaries calmly, but without apology, to disappoint others occasionally rather than disappointing yourself consistently. This shift requires developing what Machiavelli would recognize as virtue in the interpersonal realm, the ability to remain warm and caring while also remaining strong and clear about what you will and won't accept. It's similar to the difference between a river that meanders gently but consistently toward the sea, wearing away whatever obstacles it encounters through patient persistence, and a flash flood that seems powerful but quickly dissipates, leaving little lasting impact on the landscape. As these ideas settle into your understanding like sediment in still water, you might notice how this perspective transforms your relationship with conflict itself. Instead of viewing disagreements or boundary setting as threats to harmony, you can begin to see them as necessary maintenance work in the architecture of respect, small adjustments that prevent much larger structural problems from developing over time. The candles have burned lower still, and the shadows in the study have grown deeper, creating pockets of darkness between pools of golden light. There's something deeply comforting about this rhythm of light and shadow, this recognition that healthy relationships, like healthy gardens, require both seasons of growth and seasons of pruning, both moments of nurturing and moments of firm guidance. This understanding of the delicate balance between warmth and boundaries, between caring and firmness, naturally invites us to explore the practical ways these principles might manifest in everyday interactions. How does this ancient wisdom translate into the specific moments when someone crosses a line or tests a boundary? What does respectful firmness actually look like when applied to the complex social dynamics we navigate daily, from family relationships to workplace interactions to friendships that have gradually become unbalanced over time? As you contemplate these questions, you might notice how the theoretical framework we've been exploring begins to crystallize into something more tangible, a set of tools that feel both ancient in their wisdom and surprisingly modern in their application. Picture yourself walking through a peaceful garden in the late afternoon, where the golden light filters through leaves and creates patterns of warmth and coolness along the winding paths. The air carries the subtle fragrance of lavender and rosemary, herbs that have been cultivated for centuries not just for their beauty, but for their practical properties: healing, protection, clarity of thought. As you move slowly along these paths, feeling the soft earth beneath your feet and hearing the gentle murmur of water from a distant fountain, you come upon 3 distinct areas of the garden, each demonstrating a different principle of cultivation, each offering its own lesson about the art of respectful boundary setting. Perhaps you've noticed that moment when someone says something that feels like a test, not quite an insult, but not quite respect either. It's that subtle probing comment from a colleague who suggests your idea needs a lot more work in front of the whole team, or the family member who makes a joke about your appearance or choices that somehow never feels particularly funny, or the friend who consistently shows up 20 minutes late to your meetings, as if your time is less valuable than whatever delayed them. These moments carry a particular energy, a sense that something important is being negotiated beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. In the first area of this imagined garden, you discover a section dominated by tall, serene evergreens that stand in perfect stillness, despite the gentle breeze moving through their branches. These trees demonstrate the first tool that emerges from Machiavelli's insights: the power of strategic silence. Not the cold shoulder or the passive-aggressive withdrawal that punishes others for their behavior, but rather a conscious choice to respond to provocative comments with a quality of presence that is both peaceful and unmistakably strong. Strategic silence operates like those evergreens, deeply rooted, naturally dignified, unswayed by temporary storms. When someone makes a comment designed to elicit a defensive reaction, strategic silence allows you to pause in that crucial space between their action and your response, creating a moment of stillness that often reveals far more about their intentions than any immediate reply could. It's the difference between being pulled into someone else's drama and maintaining your own center of gravity, between reacting from emotion and responding from wisdom. You might recognize this quality in people who seem to carry an unusual kind of calm authority. When challenged or provoked, they don't rush to defend themselves or escalate the conflict. Instead, they simply pause. That pause isn't empty. It's full of assessment, consideration, and choice. It communicates something powerful, that their inner state isn't dependent on others' approval or disapproval, that they possess resources of strength that don't require external validation to maintain. Moving deeper into the garden, you come upon a section where the afternoon light is reflected and refracted through strategically placed mirrors and glass ornaments, creating shifting patterns that seem to turn the environment itself into a gentle interrogation of perspective. This area represents the second tool, the art of reflective questioning, what we might call the Socratic mirror. Instead of defending against a provocative comment or absorbing it passively, this approach turns the focus back onto the person making it, gently but insistently asking them to clarify their intent. "Do you mean by that?" becomes not an aggressive challenge, but a genuine inquiry that forces the other person to make explicit what they were hoping to keep implicit. "Can you help me understand what you're suggesting?" transforms a potential victim into an investigator, shifting the entire dynamic of the interaction. The person who made the original comment suddenly finds themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to justify or explain what they may have hoped would pass unnoticed. Perhaps you've experienced the effectiveness of this approach yourself, either as the questioner or as someone whose thoughtless comment was suddenly illuminated by someone else's gentle but persistent curiosity. There's something almost alchemical about how a simple question can transform the entire energy of an encounter, changing what felt like an attack into an opportunity for clarity, what seemed like a power play into a moment of mutual understanding. The third area of the garden is marked by clear boundaries, elegant stone borders that define different sections, graceful fences that protect delicate plants from being trampled, gates that welcome visitors while preserving the integrity of the space. This represents the third tool, the art of implementing consequences with the same calm clarity that characterizes everything else in this philosophical garden. Not consequences delivered in anger or designed to punish, but natural responses that protect the integrity of your boundaries while maintaining your essential kindness. These consequences might be as simple as ending a conversation when someone becomes disrespectful, or as significant as restructuring a relationship when someone consistently violates your stated limits. The key lies not in the severity of the consequence, but in its consistency and emotional neutrality. Like the garden's boundaries, these responses serve a protective function rather than a punitive one. They preserve something valuable rather than destroying something unwanted. You might notice how these three approaches share certain qualities that distinguish them from more common responses to disrespect. They all require a kind of emotional regulation that allows you to pause between stimulus and response, to choose your reaction rather than simply following your immediate impulse. They all maintain a quality of dignified calm that neither escalates conflict nor avoids it, but rather transforms it into something more manageable and potentially constructive. Interestingly, these tools work best when they feel natural rather than calculated, when they emerge from a genuine inner state of self-respect, rather than from a desire to manipulate or control others. The person who uses strategic silence effectively isn't plotting or scheming. They're simply comfortable enough with themselves that they don't feel compelled to fill every uncomfortable pause with words. The person who asks clarifying questions isn't trying to trap others. They're genuinely curious about what drives people to behave in ways that seem designed to create conflict. As the afternoon light begins to soften in this peaceful garden, creating longer shadows between the various sections and lending everything a quality of gentle timelessness, you might find yourself thinking about your own experiences with these dynamics. Perhaps you can recall moments when you successfully navigated a challenging interaction, times when you managed to maintain both your boundaries and your kindness, instances when you responded to provocation with wisdom rather than reactivity. There's something deeply reassuring about recognizing that these skills can be developed, that the ability to command respect while maintaining compassion isn't an inborn talent but a learnable capacity. Like the gardener who understands which plants need pruning and which need protection, which areas need more light and which need more water, you can develop the wisdom to know which tool serves best in which situation, which response will most effectively preserve both your dignity and your relationships. The gentle sound of water continues to flow through this contemplative space, creating a sense of continuity and peace that seems to mirror the deeper rhythms of wise human interaction. There's something about the combination of strength and gentleness, of clarity and compassion, that feels as natural and sustainable as this carefully tended garden itself, as if these qualities represent not a learned technique, but a return to our most authentic way of being in relationship with others. As these insights settle into your understanding like evening settling into the garden, you begin to sense how these practical tools are expressions of something larger, a comprehensive approach to human interaction that integrates ancient wisdom with modern psychological understanding. The question emerges naturally: how do these individual techniques fit together into a larger pattern, a more complete philosophy of respectful strength that can guide us through the full complexity of human relationships? Picture these ideas as landmarks in a vast intellectual landscape. Machiavelli's insights resting on one gentle hill, modern psychology gracefully occupying another, with bridges of understanding connecting them across valleys where mist collects and dissolves, where thoughts take shape and reform like clouds drifting through an endless sky. Imagine yourself standing on a high overlook in the early evening, when the last golden light of day illuminates different regions of this vast landscape of understanding. From this elevated perspective, you can see how what seemed like separate territories are actually part of one coherent geography, how ancient observations about human nature align remarkably with contemporary discoveries about how the mind processes social challenges. The air at this height carries the cool clarity that comes with distance, allowing you to perceive patterns that weren't visible when you were walking through individual valleys of insight. In the foreground of this expansive view lies the familiar territory we've been exploring, Machiavelli's understanding of virtù and fortuna, the delicate balance between strength and warmth, the practical tools of silence, questioning, and thoughtful consequences. These concepts feel comfortable now, like paths you've walked many times, their contours familiar and trustworthy. But as your gaze extends across this intellectual landscape, you begin to notice how these ancient insights connect seamlessly with distant peaks of modern understanding. Perhaps you can see, glimmering in the middle distance, the region that modern psychology calls emotional regulation, the capacity to pause between feeling and response, to choose your reaction rather than being carried away by immediate impulses. This isn't a foreign territory, but rather a natural extension of what Machiavelli meant by virtù, expressed in the language of contemporary science rather than Renaissance politics. The person who can use strategic silence effectively isn't employing some manipulative technique, but is simply demonstrating a sophisticated form of self-management, the ability to remain centered even when others are attempting to destabilize them. You might recognize this connection from your own experience of those moments when you successfully navigated a challenging interaction. In those instances, you weren't following a script, or employing a strategy so much as accessing a state of inner calm that allowed you to respond from wisdom rather than reactivity. Modern research confirms what Machiavelli intuited centuries ago, that the individuals who command the most respect are those who have developed what psychologists call emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and skillfully manage both their own emotions and their responses to others' emotional states. Moving your attention across this landscape of understanding, you notice another region where ancient wisdom and modern insight converge beautifully, the territory that researchers call operant conditioning, where consequences shape behavior in predictable ways. The scientific principle is elegantly simple. Behaviors that are consistently followed by pleasant outcomes tend to increase, while those followed by unpleasant consequences tend to decrease. This isn't merely an academic theory, but a practical description of how all learning occurs, from the most basic habits to the most complex social patterns. When Machiavelli suggested that respect is built through the consistent demonstration of boundaries rather than through endless accommodation, he was describing this same psychological principle in different language. The person who responds to disrespect with clear, calm consequences isn't being cruel or manipulative. They're simply allowing natural learning processes to operate. They're teaching others, through gentle but consistent experience, that certain behaviors carry costs while others carry benefits. Interestingly, this perspective reveals something profound about the nature of kindness itself. True compassion sometimes requires allowing others to experience the natural consequences of their choices, rather than protecting them from every discomfort. It's similar to how a loving parent might allow a child to experience the minor disappointment of natural consequences, rather than constantly rescuing them from every small difficulty. Understanding that this temporary discomfort serves the larger purpose of developing wisdom and self-awareness. As the light continues to shift across this vast landscape of understanding, illuminating different features and creating new patterns of shadow and brightness, you begin to notice how these psychological principles explain why certain approaches to respect and boundaries are more effective than others. The distinction between strategic silence and harmful stonewalling, for instance, becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of emotional regulation and healthy communication patterns. Strategic silence emerges from a place of inner strength and choice. It's a conscious decision to pause rather than react, to create space for wisdom rather than filling that space with potentially damaging words. Stonewalling, by contrast, represents a breakdown in emotional regulation, a protective shutdown that occurs when someone becomes overwhelmed and cannot process the interaction constructively. The external behaviors might look similar, but the internal states and long-term effects are entirely different. Perhaps you've experienced both states yourself and can recognize the distinction in your own body and mind. Strategic silence feels calm and centered, like standing in the eye of a storm where everything is still despite the motion around you. Stonewalling feels more like being frozen or trapped, cut off from both your own resources and your connection with others, unable to engage even if you wanted to. The evening light has grown softer now, creating that magical time when individual features of the landscape begin to blend into larger patterns, when the boundaries between different regions become less distinct and the underlying unity becomes more apparent. From this perspective, you can see how all these various insights, ancient and modern, philosophical and psychological, are really expressions of a single, deeper understanding about what it means to live skillfully among other complex human beings. This understanding recognizes that humans are fundamentally social creatures who have evolved sophisticated mechanisms for navigating relationships, establishing hierarchies, and maintaining cooperation within groups. The drive for respect isn't vanity or ego, but a fundamental survival instinct, a recognition that our well-being depends largely on our ability to maintain secure and dignified positions within our social networks. At the same time, this perspective acknowledges that the modern world presents challenges that our evolutionary programming didn't anticipate. We must navigate relationships with people we're not related to, in contexts that change rapidly, with consequences that extend far beyond immediate survival. This requires developing what we might call social intelligence, the ability to consciously apply wisdom rather than relying solely on instinct, to choose responses based on their long-term effects rather than their immediate emotional satisfaction. The stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky above this landscape of understanding, their distant light creating a sense of vastness and continuity that connects this moment to all the moments throughout history when human beings have struggled with these same fundamental questions. There's something deeply comforting about recognizing that the challenges you face in commanding respect, while maintaining your essential kindness, aren't unique to your circumstances or your time, but are part of the eternal human project of learning to live wisely together. As night settles more fully over this vast intellectual territory, softening the distinctions between different regions and creating a sense of peaceful unity, you begin to sense how all these various tools and insights are moving towards something even more integrated, a way of being that naturally commands respect not through the calculated application of techniques, but through the embodiment of certain qualities that others find both appealing and formidable, both warm and strong, both open and unshakable. This understanding opens a doorway to perhaps the most beautiful paradox in all of Machiavelli's wisdom, that true power often reveals itself not in the need to demonstrate strength, but in the quiet confidence that such demonstrations are rarely necessary at all. Picture yourself walking through a moonlit courtyard where ancient stone pathways wind between carefully tended beds of night-blooming flowers. The air carries the subtle fragrance of jasmine and honeysuckle, plants that release their sweetest scents only in darkness, as if they understand something profound about the relationship between gentleness and hidden strength. Overhead, stars shine with that particular clarity that comes only in the deepest part of the night, when the atmosphere has settled and the light reaches you unfiltered by the day's turbulence. In this peaceful setting, you might imagine encountering the modern equivalent of Machiavelli's prince, not a ruler of territories and armies, but someone who has mastered the art of navigating the complex social territories we all must traverse. The workplace hierarchies, the family dynamics, the friendships and partnerships and communities that form the landscape of contemporary life. This modern prince possesses no formal authority over others, yet somehow commands a quality of respect that makes others naturally inclined to treat them with consideration and care. What sets this person apart isn't any single quality, but rather the seamless integration of seemingly opposite characteristics. They possess what we might call a gentle strength, the ability to be deeply kind without being weak, to set clear boundaries without being harsh, to disagree without being disagreeable. When someone treats them with disrespect, they respond not with immediate reaction, but with a kind of thoughtful pause that seems to slow down time itself, creating space for wisdom to emerge naturally from the situation. Perhaps you've encountered someone like this in your own life, someone whose presence somehow elevates the quality of interactions around them. They don't demand attention, yet when they speak, others listen. They don't avoid conflict, yet somehow they seem to transform potential confrontations into opportunities for deeper understanding. When others are reactive, they remain centered. When others are defensive, they stay curious. When others escalate, they have a mysterious ability to create calm without suppressing the energy of those around them. This quality isn't something you can fake or perform. It emerges naturally from the deep integration of all the principles we've been exploring together. The modern prince understands that every social interaction is an opportunity to either build or erode their reputation for being someone worth respecting, someone whose boundaries deserve consideration, someone whose presence adds value rather than stress to any gathering. But this understanding doesn't make them calculating or manipulative. Instead, it makes them more authentically themselves, more able to respond from their highest wisdom rather than their immediate impulses. The night air stirs gently through the courtyard, rustling the leaves of climbing vines that have grown strong by learning to find support without losing their essential nature. There's something profound in this image. The way these plants achieve remarkable heights not by becoming rigid like trees, but by remaining flexible while developing an unerring sense of what can support their growth and what might cause them to fall. This is perhaps the perfect metaphor for the integration of strength and adaptability that characterizes the modern prince. You might recognize this quality in your own moments of greatest effectiveness, times when you were able to handle difficult situations with a combination of firmness and grace that surprised even you. In those moments, you weren't following a strategy or applying a technique. You were simply being the fullest version of yourself, accessing resources of wisdom and strength that are always available but not always accessible when you're caught up in reactive patterns of behavior. The modern prince has learned to live primarily from this integrated state, where virtue and compassion aren't opposing forces but complementary aspects of a mature approach to human relationships. They understand that kindness without boundaries eventually becomes enabling, just as strength without warmth eventually becomes isolation. The art lies in finding the dynamic balance, the ability to be soft when softness serves and firm when firmness is required, always guided by a deeper wisdom about what will best serve the long-term health of their relationships and their own integrity. Interestingly, this integration creates what we might call a deterrent effect, not through intimidation or fear, but through the simple recognition that this person isn't an easy target for manipulation, disrespect, or exploitation. They've developed what could be described as a kind of social immune system, the ability to recognize and respond appropriately to various forms of psychological pressure or boundary testing without losing their essential warmth or becoming defensive. This doesn't mean they never experience conflict or difficulty in their relationships. Rather, it means they've learned to engage with conflict as information rather than threat, as an opportunity to clarify boundaries and deepen understanding rather than as evidence that something has gone wrong. They've developed the capacity to remain curious even when others are trying to make them defensive, to stay open even when others are trying to shut them down. The stars overhead seem to pulse gently with their ancient light, each one maintaining its individual brilliance while contributing to the larger pattern of the night sky. There's something deeply reassuring about this image, the way each point of light holds its position with quiet dignity while participating in something much larger than itself. This is perhaps what the fully integrated modern prince represents, someone who has learned to maintain their individual integrity while contributing to the larger harmony of whatever community they're part of. Perhaps most beautifully, this integration reveals the ultimate wisdom in Machiavelli's approach to respect and relationships. The goal was never to dominate others or to win every confrontation, but to create conditions where confrontation becomes increasingly unnecessary. The modern prince commands respect not through the frequent demonstration of power, but through the consistent embodiment of qualities that others find both attractive and formidable. Reliability, clarity, warmth combined with strength, the ability to be both sanctuary and mountain. As these various threads of understanding weave together in the peaceful darkness of this contemplative space, you might notice how the journey we've taken together reveals a profound truth about human nature itself. We're all capable of accessing these integrated states, these moments when we respond to life's challenges with wisdom rather than reactivity, when we embody both strength and gentleness in ways that feel completely natural and authentic. The cool night air carries with it a sense of completion, as if all the various insights we've explored are settling into a unified understanding that needs no further analysis, only gentle absorption. The fragrance of night-blooming flowers continues to drift through the courtyard, reminding you that some of the most beautiful qualities reveal themselves only in quiet moments, only when the more obvious distractions of daylight have faded, and you can perceive the subtler patterns that always were present but weren't always visible. This integrated way of being, This modern expression of ancient wisdom about commanding respect while maintaining integrity naturally raises questions about how such qualities manifest in the contemporary world. How this timeless understanding translates into the specific challenges and opportunities that define our current moment in human history. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, you might notice how the principles we've been exploring together begin to illuminate the subtle patterns that shape everyday interactions, revealing dignity and strength not as grand gestures, but as quiet consistencies that accumulate over time like interest in an account you didn't know you had been building. Picture yourself moving through the soft pre-dawn hours of an ordinary day, when the world feels hushed and possibilities seem to hover just beneath the surface of routine activities. The air carries that particular coolness that belongs to early morning, and through windows you can see the gentle transition from deep blue to pale gray that announces the approaching day. In these quiet moments before the world fully awakens, you might find yourself reflecting on how the wisdom of respectful strength weaves itself into the fabric of contemporary life, not through dramatic confrontations, but through countless small choices that shape the texture of your relationships and the quality of your daily experience. In your own life, you might notice how people treat those who consistently maintain boundaries with grace and firmness. Perhaps you've observed how the colleague who quietly refuses to answer work emails after a certain hour isn't criticized for being difficult, but is actually respected for having clear priorities. Or how the friend who always arrives on time isn't seen as rigid, but as someone whose presence can be counted upon, whose yes means yes, and whose no means no. These aren't people who make a show of their standards, but rather those who embody them so naturally that others adjust their behavior accordingly, almost without conscious thought. There's something profoundly peaceful about recognizing how respect flows toward those who make it easy for others to know where they stand. It's similar to how we all appreciate clear trail markers when hiking through unfamiliar territory, not because we enjoy restrictions, but because clarity about boundaries allows us to move with confidence rather than constantly wondering whether we're about to step somewhere we shouldn't. The person who communicates their limits calmly and consistently provides this same kind of valuable clarity in social terrain. You might find that the strongest people you know are often the gentlest, until they need not to be. They possess what could be described as a relaxed alertness, like a cat resting in a sunny spot, but instantly aware if something requires their attention. They don't go looking for battles, but when boundaries are tested, they respond with a kind of calm decisiveness that resolves situations before they can escalate into larger conflicts. Their strength doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but reveals itself in the absence of drama, in the way difficult situations somehow become manageable in their presence. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself in moments when you successfully navigated a challenging interaction, not through clever tactics, but through staying connected to your own center of gravity. In those instances, you might have noticed how maintaining your inner calm allowed you to respond rather than react, how pausing to breathe created space for wisdom to emerge naturally from the situation. These weren't moments of weakness or avoidance, but rather demonstrations of what Machiavelli would recognize as true virtue, the ability to meet unpredictable challenges with steady strength. The growing daylight filters through windows now, creating patterns of warmth and shadow that shift gently across familiar spaces. There's something deeply comforting about this daily transition from night to day, this reliable rhythm that continues regardless of our personal struggles or triumphs, reminding us that dignity and integrity aren't destinations to be reached, but rather qualities to be lived, moment by moment, choice by choice. In modern workplace dynamics, you might observe how respect gravitates toward those who can disagree without being disagreeable, who can hold firm positions without making others wrong for holding different ones. These individuals seem to understand intuitively that most professional conflicts aren't really about the surface issues being discussed, but about the underlying human needs for recognition, autonomy, and dignity. By addressing these deeper needs while also maintaining their own boundaries, they transform potential adversaries into collaborators. Interestingly, this approach often proves more effective than traditional power dynamics precisely because it doesn't attempt to force compliance through authority or intimidation. Instead, it creates conditions where cooperation feels natural and mutual respect becomes the foundation for genuine productivity. The person who embodies these qualities doesn't need to demand respect. It flows toward them naturally because others recognize someone who makes relationships safer and more rewarding for everyone involved. As you consider your own family dynamics, you might notice how these principles apply even in the most intimate relationships. Perhaps you've observed how the family members who command the most genuine respect aren't necessarily those who insist on formal deference, but rather those who consistently demonstrate care for others while also maintaining clear boundaries about what they will and won't accept. They've learned the delicate art of being both sanctuary and mountain, offering warmth and support while also being unmistakably solid in their core values. The morning light has grown stronger now, revealing the details of the day with increasing clarity. Birds have begun their morning songs, creating a soundtrack of life continuing its eternal rhythms of rest and activity, challenge and response, solitude and connection. In this gentle soundtrack, you might hear echoes of the larger themes we've been exploring: how strength and gentleness can coexist, how boundaries and kindness can reinforce each other, how ancient wisdom finds new expression in contemporary circumstances. You might find that the most respectful approach to relationships involves recognizing that different situations call for different tools from your repertoire of responses. Sometimes strategic silence serves best, allowing space for others to recognize the implications of their own words or actions. Sometimes gentle questioning opens doorways to deeper understanding, transforming potential conflicts into opportunities for connection. Sometimes clear consequences are necessary to protect the integrity of the relationship itself, preventing small violations from growing into larger ones. The art lies not in applying these approaches mechanically, but in developing the wisdom to sense which response serves the highest good in any given moment. This kind of discernment grows naturally from the integration of strength and compassion we've been exploring, from the recognition that true power often reveals itself through restraint rather than force, through clarity rather than confusion, through consistency rather than unpredictability. Perhaps most beautifully, this way of being in relationship creates what could be described as an upward spiral in your social interactions. As you consistently demonstrate that you can be both strong and kind, both open and boundaried, others begin to respond with their own highest qualities rather than their defensive patterns. Relationships become more honest because people know they can trust you with difficult truths. Conversations become more meaningful because there's less energy wasted on managing unspoken tensions or navigating unclear expectations. The day has fully arrived now, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of activity and responsibility that structure our contemporary lives. Yet beneath these surface patterns, you carry the deeper understanding that respect isn't something you chase or demand, but something you cultivate through the patient demonstration of qualities that make others feel both safe and inspired in your presence. As this gentle exploration of practical wisdom settles into your understanding like morning settling into the day, one final insight emerges from this ancient teaching about dignity and strength, perhaps the most profound recognition of all, about what it truly means to live with integrity in a world that often seems to reward other qualities entirely. Following this thread deeper, into the quiet spaces where understanding dissolves into being, we discover something beautiful about the ultimate nature of power itself, something that Machiavelli intuited but perhaps could never have fully articulated in his time of political upheaval and external threats. Picture yourself returning once more to that candlelit study outside Florence, but now in the deepest part of the night, when even the crickets have grown quiet, and the only sound is the gentle whisper of wind through olive branches beyond the window. The candles have burned very low, creating pools of golden light that seem to float in an ocean of soft darkness, and the air carries the cool fragrance of night-blooming jasmine mixed with the lingering scent of old parchment and melted wax. In this hushed atmosphere, where time seems to move with the rhythm of breathing rather than the urgency of clocks, the final wisdom reveals itself with the gentle inevitability of dawn approaching the horizon. What if true strength is knowing you could respond decisively, but choosing not to need to? This question emerges from the shadows like a whispered secret, carrying with it the recognition that the highest expression of power is often its own restraint, that the most formidable individuals are frequently those who have transcended the need to prove their strength to others or even to themselves. There's something almost paradoxical about this realization, that the ultimate goal of developing the capacity to command respect is to create conditions where commanding respect becomes unnecessary. Perhaps you've glimpsed this state in your own moments of deepest confidence, times when you felt so secure in your own worth and capabilities that the opinions or actions of others seem to lose their power to disturb your inner equilibrium. In those moments, you might have noticed how naturally respect flowed toward you, not because you demanded it or strategically elicited it, but because others could sense in your presence a quality of settled strength that felt both reassuring and inspiring. The candle flames flickered gently in the night air, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls that seem to illustrate this very principle. How something can be both constant and ever-changing, both solid and fluid, both present and somehow beyond the need for presence. This is the essence of what we might call integrated power. The ability to be fully yourself while remaining completely adaptable, to hold firm boundaries while staying open to connection, to command respect while never losing your essential kindness. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice how it reframes everything we've explored together on this philosophical journey. The tools of strategic silence, reflective questioning, and thoughtful consequences aren't really techniques to be applied but natural expressions of an inner state where strength and gentleness have become so thoroughly integrated that they're no longer separate qualities requiring conscious coordination. They simply flow from you like water flowing from a spring, effortless and inexhaustible, because they arise from your deepest nature rather than from surface strategies. Interestingly, this understanding reveals why the most powerful people often appear to be the most relaxed. They've discovered something that those still struggling for recognition haven't yet realized: that the energy spent trying to prove your worth to others is energy that could be directed toward actually becoming worthy of respect, that the attention focused on managing others' perceptions is attention that could be invested in developing the qualities that naturally attract positive regard. The night has grown deeper still, and through the window you can see stars beginning to emerge with that crystal clarity that comes only in the darkest hours, when the sky becomes a vast field of light puncturing infinite darkness. Each star maintains its individual brilliance while participating in constellations, patterns of meaning that connect distant points of light into stories that have guided travelers for millennia. This celestial display offers a perfect metaphor for the kind of presence we've been exploring: luminous, constant, connected to something larger than itself, yet never diminished by that connection. Perhaps the highest form of virtue is creating relationships where fortuna's storms rarely reach, where the very quality of your being acts as a kind of shelter that allows others to relax into their own authenticity, rather than forcing them into defensive postures. This doesn't mean avoiding all conflict or challenge, but rather approaching these inevitable aspects of human relationship from such a centered place that they become opportunities for deeper understanding rather than threats to be defended against. You might recognize this quality in the people who have most influenced your own development, not necessarily those who were always agreeable or who avoided difficult conversations, but those who somehow managed to make even challenging interactions feel safe and constructive. They possess the mysterious ability to disagree without making you feel rejected, to set boundaries without making you feel punished, to maintain their own integrity while honoring yours. The soft darkness beyond the candlelight seems to pulse gently with the rhythm of breath, and you might find yourself naturally synchronizing with this deeper rhythm, feeling your own breathing slow and deepen as these final insights settle into the quiet spaces of understanding. There's something profoundly peaceful about recognizing that the journey toward commanding respect is ultimately a journey toward becoming so comfortable with yourself that others naturally feel comfortable around you, so secure in your own worth that you can afford to be generous with recognition of others' worth. This is perhaps what Machiavelli glimpsed but couldn't fully articulate in his historical context, that the ultimate expression of political wisdom is the creation of conditions where politics itself becomes less necessary, where relationships are governed more by mutual respect and genuine affection than by strategic maneuvering and careful calculation of advantages. It's the difference between ruling through fear and inspiring through example, between demanding obedience and earning devotion. As these thoughts dissolve and reform like clouds drifting across the night sky, you begin to sense how this ancient wisdom about commanding respect opens into something even larger, a way of being in the world that transcends the immediate concerns of interpersonal dynamics and touches something universal about human dignity and connection. The boundary between commanding respect and simply being worthy of respect begins to blur, like the horizon line where night meets approaching dawn. Perhaps you've noticed that the strongest people rarely need to tell others they're strong, just as the wisest rarely need to announce their wisdom, and the most loving rarely need to proclaim their love. These qualities speak for themselves through the accumulated evidence of countless small choices, countless moments of choosing the higher response over the easier one, the more generous interpretation over the more defensive one, the longer view over the shorter one. The candles have burned down to their final pools of wax now, their light growing softer and more diffuse, creating an atmosphere that seems to hover between waking and sleeping, between understanding and mystery, between effort and grace. In this liminal space, the final wisdom whispers itself into consciousness. That respect, like love, like wisdom itself, is not something you can chase or capture or hold, but something that emerges naturally when you become the kind of person who embodies the qualities that inspire these responses in others. And so we release these insights into the quiet wisdom of the night, trusting that understanding, like respect, is built not through force or manipulation, but through the gentle consistency of being who we choose to be, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath, until the very essence of dignity becomes as natural as breathing itself, as effortless as the stars maintaining their courses through the vast darkness, as inevitable as morning returning to bless the world with light. Until rest comes, and with it the peaceful recognition that wisdom, once truly understood, needs no effort to maintain, but simply flows from the deep well of integrated being, like water finding its way to the sea. And so these thoughts settle like evening mist, no longer separate from the quiet spaces of your mind, drifting through consciousness like Machiavelli's own wondering became part of the eternal question about what it means to be both strong and gentle in this world. Perhaps you've already begun to forget the specific words, letting them dissolve into something deeper than memory, something that lives in the space between knowing and being, where respect flows not from what you do but from who you are becoming, moment by moment, breath by breath. These ancient insights melting into the texture of sleep itself, where wisdom needs no effort to maintain but simply flows like water finding its way to the sea, like starlight touching the earth without any intention of illuminating, just being what it is. And perhaps by morning these ideas will have taken root in ways you'll never quite remember but will somehow always know, part of the vast quiet that holds all questions and all answers, all strength and all tenderness, all seeking and all finding, as you drift deeper into wherever these thoughts are taking you, beyond words, beyond effort, beyond the need to hold on to anything at all.